The story of music is a story written not in ink, but in silence. It is a story that begins long before the first note was ever consciously played, in the primordial symphony of the world itself. To understand how humanity first learned to add its own voice to this ancient chorus, we must first listen to the world as our earliest ancestors heard it. Imagine, if you will, a time not marked by calendars or clocks, but by the slow turning of the earth and the gradual lengthening of shadows. This was a world alive with sound, a vast and untamed landscape of auditory experience. There was the constant whisper of the wind, a breath moving through pine needles and across grassy plains, sometimes rising to a howl that spoke of unseen forces. There was the steady, percussive rhythm of rain, falling on leaves, on water, on hard-packed earth, each surface transforming the droplets into different tonalities. There was the deep, resonant rumble of thunder, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very bones of the world. And cutting through these elemental sounds were the voices of life itself, the chirruping of crickets in the twilight, a rhythmic scraping that filled the night air, the complex songs of birds, each melody a declaration of territory or a call for a mate, the howl of a wolf, a long, lonely note that carried for miles across the valleys. This was the first music, the background score to human existence, and it was into this world of natural melody and rhythm that the human ear first learned to listen. And listen they did. For these early humans, sound was not merely decoration. It was information, it was warning, it was the fabric of survival. The snap of a twig could mean danger, the gurgle of a stream could mean life-giving water. The specific call of a particular bird could signal the presence of a predator or the location of food. The human brain became a sophisticated instrument for processing these sounds, for finding patterns in the chaos, for anticipating what might come next, based on the auditory clues of the present. It was from this deep, intuitive connection to the soundscape that the first spark of musical consciousness was born. It began, perhaps, not with creation, but with imitation. A hunter, waiting in the stillness of the forest, might try to mimic the call of a bird to lure his prey closer. A mother, soothing her child, might find herself replicating the gentle, rhythmic swishing of the wind, or the soft, guttural cooing of a dove. The human voice, that most primary of instruments, was the first to be consciously manipulated, not for speech, but for sound itself. It learned to hum, to whistle, to click, to create tones that were not words, but were expressive nonetheless. They were expressions of feeling, of a connection to the world, a way of saying, I am here, and I hear you. Then came the discovery of rhythm, the heartbeat of all music. It was discovered in the most fundamental of human actions, walking. The steady bipedal gait of a human produces a natural, repeating pattern step, 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 step. The act of working, of pounding roots or grains with a stone, created another rhythm, a purposeful, forceful beat. The act of clapping hands in joy or celebration created a sharp, percussive sound that was instantly gratifying. The human body itself was the first drum. People would have slapped their thighs, stamped their feet, clapped their hands together, creating complex polyrhythms around fires at night. This was not yet music as we would formally define it, but it was the bedrock upon which it would be built. It was the physical manifestation of a pulse, a shared experience that could synchronize a group, that could express a collective emotion, that could turn a collection of individuals into a single, cohesive unit, moving and sounding as one. The firelight would flicker on their faces, the shadows would dance, and the air would be filled with the simple, powerful music of the human body in motion, a testament to life and community in a vast and mysterious world. But the body had its limitations. The voice could only project so far, the hands could only clap so loudly. The next great leap, the moment that truly marks the invention of music, was when a human being first picked up an object from the world around them and used it not as a tool for survival, but as a tool for sound. This was a conceptual revolution. It was the moment our ancestors stopped being just listeners and participants in the world's symphony and became its composers, its conductors. It might have happened by accident. A dry gourd, fallen from a vine, with seeds rattling inside, shaken and producing a mesmerizing, rustling rhythm. A piece of wood, hollowed out by insects, struck with a stick and producing a deep, resonant tone that was wholly new, a sound that did not exist in nature until human intention called it forth. A thigh bone from a large animal, dried and hardened by the sun, that when struck produced a clear, sharp knock. Or perhaps it was a tense string, maybe a vine or a sinew, stretched between 2 points and plucked, producing a sustained, vibrating tone that was unlike anything else. In that moment of discovery, the universe of possibility exploded. The human world was no longer just filled with sounds to be heard. It was now filled with objects that could be played. The musician was born, and with them, the first instrument. And so our journey into the dawn of music begins here, at this fragile, flickering moment of discovery, where the silence of the stone and the bone and the gourd was broken forever by the curious, creative hand of humanity. From that first spark of curiosity, a new kind of exploration began. It was no longer just about finding food or shelter. It was about exploring the sonic potential of the world. Every material, every object, held a secret sound waiting to be released. The forests and riverbanks became a vast workshop of acoustic experimentation. Gourds of different sizes, some filled with pebbles, some with dried seeds, produced a spectrum of shaking sounds. From a soft hiss to a loud, commanding rattle. These were the first percussion instruments, held in the hand, their rhythms dictating the pace of a dance or a ritual. Sticks and bones were no longer just tools. They were clappers, struck together to create sharp, cracking noises that cut through the air. A hollow log, found fallen and rotting on the forest floor, became the first drum. When struck with a heavy branch, it did not just make a sound. It produced a deep, booming voice that seemed to speak for the earth itself. This sound carried over distances. It could signal, it could warn, it could summon. It was a sound of power and community, a sound that could be felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. The development of the flute represents one of the most profound leaps in early musical technology. It required a more complex thought process, a manipulation of nature to create a very specific and beautiful sound. It likely began with the simple act of whistling through a hollow reed, perhaps a piece of rivergrass. Someone discovered that by blowing air across the broken end of certain bones, particularly the large hollow wing bones of birds like swans or vultures, a clear flute-like tone could be produced. The oldest known musical instruments in the world are flutes carved from bird bone and mammoth ivory, found in caves in Germany. These are not crude noisemakers. They are sophisticated instruments, carefully crafted with finger holes placed to produce different pitches. Imagine the mind of that ancient artisan, patiently carving, scraping, and testing, listening for the precise note that would emerge when a finger was lifted from a hole. This was the birth of melody, of the ability to sequence different tones in a meaningful, expressive order. The sound of that bone flute in a dark cave, perhaps illuminated only by a flickering fire, would have been hauntingly beautiful, a human breath transformed into a pure, sustained note, a voice from the spirit world made audible. It was a sound that could express sorrow, longing, or a simple, profound joy, emotions that were now given a new language. As these early instruments evolved, so did their role in society. Music began to weave itself into the very fabric of daily life and spiritual belief. The rhythmic pounding of stones on grinding slabs to process grain was accompanied by singing, turning labor from a chore into a communal activity. Hunters would use rattles and chants in rituals before a hunt, not just as practice, but to invoke the spirit of the animal and to ensure a successful outcome. Shamans, the intermediaries between the physical and spiritual worlds, used the repetitive, driving beat of drums and the eerie, whistling melodies of flutes to enter trance states. In the flickering darkness of a cave, these sounds would have been overwhelming, bypassing the conscious mind to speak directly to the soul. The music was a bridge. It was a bridge between the people in the cave and the animal spirits painted on the walls. It was a bridge between the living and the memory of their ancestors. It was a bridge between the individual and the collective, uniting the group in a shared, rhythmic heartbeat. Music became a technology of connection, as vital for the community's spiritual and emotional well-being as the spear was for its physical survival. It was not an entertainment. It was a fundamental part of what it meant to be human, to be part of a tribe, and to live in a world alive with unseen forces. With the dawn of agriculture and the rise of the first great civilizations along the fertile banks of rivers like the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus, music underwent a profound transformation. It evolved from a practice rooted in the immediate, natural world to an organized, structured art form, deeply integrated into the machinery of society, state, and religion. In the sprawling mud-brick cities of Mesopotamia, music left the exclusive realm of the shaman's cave and entered the temple and the palace. It became a powerful tool for the state, a sonic representation of divine order and royal power. The Sumerians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, developed a rich and complex musical culture. We know this from the countless clay tablets and intricate carvings they left behind, depicting musicians and their instruments in great detail. The lyre emerged as an instrument of immense prestige and beauty. These were not simple, rustic noisemakers. They were works of art, often inlaid with lapis lazuli and gold, their resonating boxes carved into the shape of powerful bulls, symbolizing the strength of the gods and the king. The sound of the lyre was likely warm and resonant, its strings plucked by skilled musicians to accompany hymns and epic poetry, like the tale of Gilgamesh. The music was a crucial part of the liturgy, a way to praise the gods and ensure their continued favor, which in turn ensured the fertility of the land and the stability of the kingdom. In ancient Egypt, music was inseparable from every aspect of life and the afterlife. It was the breath of the gods. The goddess Hathor was the patron of music, joy and love, and her rituals were filled with the ecstatic shaking of the sistrum, a sacred rattle whose metallic jangling was believed to ward off evil spirits and appease the deity. Musicians held a high status in Egyptian society, often attached to the temples of the gods or the court of the pharaoh. The scenes painted on the walls of tombs are not merely decorations, they are blueprints for eternity. They show harpists, lute players, flautists, and percussionists, ensuring that the deceased would be accompanied by music's joy for all eternity. The music itself was both celebratory and deeply spiritual. Simple frame drums and clappers provided rhythm for dancers at festivals, while in the solemn depths of a temple, the long haunting notes of a single flute or the serene harmonies of a harp would accompany the rituals of the priests. The Egyptians understood the dual nature of music, its power to incite ecstatic celebration and to induce a state of profound, sacred peace. It was a gift from the gods, a necessary component of cosmic order, or mat, and its presence was required in both the world of the living and the world of the dead. Meanwhile, in the vast fertile plains of China, a different but equally sophisticated musical philosophy was taking shape. During the Zhou dynasty, music was not merely an art, it was a fundamental force of cosmic harmony. The Chinese philosophers, most notably Confucius, believed that music had the power to influence the moral character of the individual and, by extension, the health of the state. Proper music, known as yu, was music that was balanced, refined, and in harmony with the natural order. It was believed to cultivate virtue and righteousness in the listener. Conversely, chaotic or sensual music was thought to corrupt the spirit and lead to social disorder. This philosophical understanding led to the creation of incredibly precise and complex instruments. The most famous of these is the set of Byongzhong, magnificent bronze bells cast to produce two distinct, perfectly tuned pitches when struck on different points. These chime sets, some consisting of dozens of bells, represent a staggering achievement in metallurgy and acoustic science. Their sound was not for mere entertainment. It was a formal, ritualistic sound, used in court ceremonies and ancestral worship to align human society with the harmonious rhythms of the cosmos. Music, in ancient China, was a tool for governing, a sonic architecture for building a virtuous and stable civilization. As humanity mastered the smelting of bronze and later iron, the sonic landscape of the ancient world grew richer and more powerful. New instruments emerged, their voices carrying further, their tones more complex and commanding. The lyre evolved into the larger, more robust kithara in Greece, an instrument capable of filling an amphitheater with its sound. Double reed instruments, ancestors of the modern oboe and bassoon, like the Greek aulos, produced a sharp, penetrating, and often ecstatic sound that was central to festivals dedicated to gods like Dionysus. This was the music of drama and competition, of the great Olympic Games and the theatrical tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles. Music was no longer just for ritual. It was a public art, a vital part of civic life and education. In Greece, the very science of sound was born. Pythagoras, experimenting with a single-stringed instrument called the monochord, discovered the mathematical relationships that govern musical intervals. He found that dividing a string in half produced the interval of an octave, a ratio of 2 to 1. Dividing it in a ratio of 3 to 2 produced the perfect fifth. This was a revelation. The Greeks realized that the laws of music were the same laws that governed the motion of the planets, the concept of the music of the spheres. Harmony was not just a pleasant sound. It was a fundamental principle of the universe, a cosmic order that could be expressed through mathematics and heard through carefully tuned strings. To the West, the Romans adopted and adapted the musical traditions of the Greeks and the Etruscans, but with a characteristically practical and militaristic bent. Music was deeply woven into the fabric of Roman public life, but it often served a functional or spectacular purpose. The Roman army marched to the sound of the tuba, a long, straight bronze trumpet, and the cornu, a circular brass instrument. These signals controlled the movements of vast legions on the battlefield, their clear, piercing notes cutting through the chaos of combat. In the public games, massive organs, powered by water pressure or bellows, provided a thundering, awe-inspiring backdrop to the spectacles in the Colosseum. Hydraulic music was not subtle. It was a sound of immense power and engineering prowess, a demonstration of Roman grandeur and control. While Roman philosophers like Boethius preserved Greek musical theory, Roman practice favored music for entertainment and public utility. It was the sound of triumph in a military procession, the accompaniment for a lavish banquet, or the thrilling noise of the circus. The Roman approach demonstrated music's versatility. It could be a tool for philosophical contemplation, a weapon of war, or a source of mass entertainment, its character shaped entirely by the culture that wielded it. Yet, even as the empires of Greece and Rome rose and fell, another musical current was flowing, one that would eventually merge with these classical traditions to form the bedrock of Western music. This was the music of the Near East, of the Hebrews and the early Christians. In the Temple of Jerusalem, music was a central element of worship. The Book of Psalms is filled with exhortations to praise God with the harp, the lyre, the shofar, and the voice. Levites were appointed as singers and musicians, their chants and instrumental accompaniments forming a complex and solemn liturgy. This tradition of sacred song was inherited by the early Christian Church. However, in the catacombs and the small secret house churches of the Roman Empire, the instruments of the temple were largely set aside. The focus shifted almost entirely to the human voice. The plainchant or Gregorian chant that began to develop was a music of pure melody, unaccompanied and monophonic. Its flowing, unmeasured rhythms and serene, modal melodies were designed not to entertain, but to lift the soul towards the divine, to clothe the sacred texts in a garment of pure, unadorned sound. This was a radical shift, a move away from the complex, polytheistic instrumentation of the ancient world towards a new, inward-looking, and spiritually focused sonic ideal. As the Roman Empire receded, the great stabilizing and cultural force across Europe became the Christian Church. Within the protective walls of monasteries and the rising stone of cathedrals, the musical tradition of plainchant was meticulously cultivated and standardized. This was the music of the cloister, a river of sound that flowed through the daily hours of prayer, from the first matins in the dark of night to the final compline before sleep. The chant was a collective breath, a communal offering. Its melodies, passed down orally for centuries, were eventually captured in a revolutionary new technology, musical notation. Initially, small signs called neumes were scribbled above the words of liturgical texts, indicating the general contour of the melody, whether the voice should rise or fall. This was a memory aid, a sketch of the sound. But over time, these neumes evolved. A Benedictine monk named Guido of Arezzo, in the 11th century, made a series of breakthroughs that would change music forever. He gave names to the notes, sut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, based on the syllables of a hymn to St. John. More importantly, he developed the staff, the set of lines and spaces that could precisely indicate the pitch of a note. Now, a melody could be written down and read by anyone, anywhere, without having heard it first. Music was liberated from the fallibility of human memory. It could now be composed, preserved, and disseminated with an unprecedented accuracy. This newfound ability to write music down led to the next great revolution, polyphony. For 1,000 years, the music of the church had been monophonica, single, unaccompanied, melodic line. But somewhere, in the great musical centers, like the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris during the 12th century, musicians began to experiment. They began to add a second voice to the existing plainchant. At first, this second voice moved in parallel motion, a perfect fourth or fifth below the original. creating a hollow, majestic sound. This was called organon. But the composers, figures like Leonin and Peretin, grew more ambitious. They began to write lines that moved independently of the chant, weaving around it, crossing over it, creating a complex and thrilling interplay of voices. The chant melody, the cantus firmus, was now stretched out into long, sustained notes, while the other voices danced above it with intricate, rhythmic patterns. This was the birth of true counterpoint, the art of combining independent melodic lines into a harmonious whole. The sound that filled Notre Dame was unlike anything heard before, a vast, shimmering architectural sound built of interlocking voices, a sonic reflection of the Gothic arches and stained glass windows that surrounded the worshippers. Music was no longer just a single line. It had become a vertical, harmonic structure, a universe of sound expanding upwards and outwards. This explosion of musical complexity created a new need, a way to precisely measure time. The free-flowing, unmeasured rhythms of chant were insufficient for coordinating multiple independent voices. Thus, the system of rhythmic modes was developed, a set of repeating patterns of long and short notes that gave structure and coherence to the polyphonic texture. The music of the High Middle Ages and the budding Renaissance became a sophisticated interplay of both pitch and rhythm, meticulously planned and written down. This was no longer purely spontaneous or improvisational music. It was a composed art, the work of a master architect of sound. The role of the composer was born, distinct from the performer, and with this music began its long journey from the exclusive domain of the liturgy into the realm of high art, a journey that would see it become ever more complex, expressive, and personal, setting the stage for the great flowering of the Renaissance. The intellectual and artistic flourishing of the Renaissance breathed a new spirit into the world of music. The rigid structures of the medieval mind began to soften, replaced by a humanistic curiosity and a renewed interest in the emotions and experiences of the individual. This transformation was deeply reflected in the music of the time, which began to shift its gaze from the divine heavens to the human heart. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century was as revolutionary for music as it was for literature. Now, sheet music could be mass-produced, allowing compositions to travel across Europe with unprecedented speed. A motet written in Flanders could be performed in Venice within a matter of months. This created an international musical language and fostered a vibrant exchange of ideas among composers, leading to a rapid and sophisticated evolution of musical style. Polyphony, born in the cathedrals, reached a golden age of intricate beauty and balance. Composers like Josquin des Prez, Giovanni Pierluigi, da Palestrina, and Orlandi de Lassis became masters of this art, their names celebrated across the continent. They perfected the technique of imitative counterpoint, where a melodic idea would be passed from one voice to another, weaving a dense and beautifully integrated tapestry of sound. The music was still primarily sacred, written for the Mass and the motet, but its purpose was evolving. The goal was not just to praise God, but to do so with the most perfect, harmonious, and emotionally resonant art possible. The sound was full, serene, and perfectly balanced, each vocal line possessing its own melodic integrity while blending seamlessly with the others. It was a musical embodiment of the Renaissance ideals of proportion, order, and idealized beauty. But the Renaissance was not confined to the church. In the courts of nobles and wealthy merchants, secular music flourished. The madrigal became the quintessential form of secular expression. These were part songs, usually for 4 to 6 voices, set to poetic texts about love, nature, mythology, and the pleasures and pains of human life. The madrigal composers developed a technique known as word painting, where the music directly illustrated the meaning of the text. A mention of heaven would send the melody soaring to a high note. Words like sigh or grief would be set to descending. Dissonant phrases, the idea of running water, would be conveyed by quick, flowing passages. This was a profound development. Music was now being used, not just for abstract beauty or religious devotion, but to illustrate and amplify human emotion and the meaning of words. It was becoming a form of heightened, emotional speech. In the home, around a table, friends would gather to sing these madrigals for their own pleasure, making music a domestic and social activity. Accompanying this secular trend was the rise of instrumental music as an independent art. Consorts of viols, families of stringed instruments, played intricate polyphonic works. Lutenists developed a complex repertoire of their own. The dance forms of the court, the stately pavan, and the lively gallad were written down and played, their rhythms and melodies crafted for listening as much as for movement. The world of sound was expanding, becoming more personal, more expressive, and more intimately connected to the full spectrum of human experience. As the 17th century dawned, the balanced polyphonic ideal of the Renaissance gave way to a new aesthetic, one of intense emotion, dramatic contrast, and breathtaking grandeur. This was the Baroque era, a period where music sought to move the passions of the listener with unprecedented force. The scientific discoveries of the age, revealing a universe of mathematical laws and immense scale, inspired artists to create works of similar power and complexity. The single most important innovation of this period was the birth of opera in the courts of Florence. A group of intellectuals, the Florentine Camerata, sought to recreate what they believed was the powerful musical declamation of ancient Greek tragedy. They developed a new style of singing, a halfway point between speech and song, which they called style rappresentativo, or operatic style. This was the origin of recitative, a vehicle for advancing the plot, followed by arias, which were moments of frozen time for the expression of a single, powerful emotion. Opera was a total art form, combining poetry, music, drama, and scenic spectacle, and it took Europe by storm. From the majestic, mythologically charged operas of Claudio Monteverdi in Venice to the later, brilliantly ornate works of George Friedrich Handel in London, opera became the most prestigious and popular musical entertainment, a mirror to the passions, politics, and power of the age. This new dramatic impulse required a new musical foundation, the basso continuo, or figured bass. This was a small ensemble, typically a keyboard instrument, like the harpsichord or organ, paired with a sustaining instrument, like a cello or bassoon, that provided a harmonic and rhythmic foundation for the music. The keyboard player would read from a musical line that had numbers, or figures, written below it, indicating the chords to be improvised. This system created a powerful polarity between the bass line and the melody, a structure that allowed for tremendous freedom and expressivity on top of a solid foundation. It was the engine room of Baroque music, driving it forward with relentless energy. This new emphasis on harmony and a strong bass line led to the development of tonality, the system of major and minor keys that would dominate Western music for the next 250 years. This system created a sense of expectation and resolution, a musical journey that could evoke feelings of tension, release, joy, and sorrow with a new and powerful logic. The spirit of the Baroque found its ultimate expression in the music of two towering and vastly different geniuses, Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel. Bach, working primarily in German churches and courts, was the master of counterpoint and profound spiritual expression. He absorbed every musical style of his time and synthesized them into a body of work of staggering intellectual depth and emotional power. In his sacred cantatas, passions, and monumental works like the Mass in B minor, he used the techniques of his era-complex fugues, expressive recitatives, and stirring chorales to explore the entirety of the human relationship with the divine. His music was a cosmic order, an intricate and perfect architecture of sound. Handel, in contrast, was a master of public spectacle. He conquered London with his Italian operas and later, his English oratorios, like the Mighty Messiah. Handel had an unparalleled gift for melody and dramatic timing. His music was grand, direct, and immediately appealing, designed to thrill a paying audience. Together, Bach and Handel represented the two poles of the Baroque, the introspective, complex world of sacred and intellectual music, and the extroverted, dramatic world of public theatre. Their legacy was a musical language of immense expressive range, a language that had learned to speak not just of beauty, but of the very drama of the human soul. Following the profound complexities and intense passions of the Baroque, a new wind began to blow through the concert halls and salons of Europe. By the mid-18th century, a preference emerged for clarity, balance, and graceful melody. This was the classical period, an age of enlightenment that valued reason, order, and natural expression. The intricate polyphony of Bach gave way to a new texture, melody, and accompaniment. The goal was no longer to weave multiple equally important voices together, but to present a beautiful, singable tune supported by harmonious chords. This new style was perfectly suited to the emerging forms of the era, most importantly the symphony. the string quartet, and the solo concerto. These forms were built on the principle of contrast and development, creating a musical narrative that was both intellectually satisfying and emotionally engaging. The heart of this new style was the sonata form, a structure that would become the foundation for most instrumental music for the next century. It presented a musical argument, a first theme, often strong and rhythmic, a second theme, usually more lyrical and gentle, would be introduced. These themes would then be developed, broken apart, and explored in a section of tension and drama, before finally being restated in a recapitulation that brought resolution and balance. It was a musical drama in miniature, a journey from stability, through conflict, and back to a renewed stability. The center of this musical revolution was the city of Vienna, which became a magnet for the greatest musical talent of the age. Here, three composers, whose names would become synonymous with the classical ideal, forged a legacy that would define the sound of an era. Franz Joseph Haydn, the good-natured and prolific father of the symphony, perfected the forms that his younger contemporaries would inherit. In his over 100 symphonies and dozens of string quartets, he established the standard four-movement structure and infused the music with wit, surprise, and a profound sense of proportion. His music was the sound of enlightened optimism, full of clever humor and earthy vigor. Then came Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, the divinely gifted prodigy. Mozart took the structures Haydn had refined and filled them with an unparalleled melodic beauty and psychological depth. His operas, like The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, gave voice to characters of astonishing realism and complexity. His symphonies and concertos combined effortless grace with dramatic power, achieving a perfect balance between heart and mind, form and emotion. The music seemed to flow from him with a natural, inevitable logic, as if he were merely transcribing a beauty that already existed in the air. The third giant of the era, Ludwig van Beethoven, stands as a colossal bridge between the classical and romantic worlds. His early works were firmly rooted in the Viennese classical tradition of Haydn and Mozart, but even then there was a new intensity, a raw power and individuality that pushed against the boundaries of polite convention. As he progressed, his music grew in scale, ambition, and emotional range. His Symphony No. 3, the Eroica, was a landmark, a work of such unprecedented length, complexity, and raw power that it shattered the classical mold. It was no longer merely entertainment. It was a personal statement, a spiritual journey, a force of nature. Beethoven began to use music, not just to please, but to express the deepest struggles and triumphs of the human spirit. He transformed the elegant conversation of the classical style into a personal confession. By the time of his late works, he had opened a door to a new world of musical expression, a world where the artist was a prophet and a hero, setting the stage for the stormy, subjective, and passionate age of romanticism that was soon to dawn. The 19th century ushered in an age of intense personal expression, where the individual's emotions, dreams, and struggles became the central subject of art. This was the Romantic era, and in music, it meant a decisive shift from the balanced structures of classicism to a world of heightened passion, poetic imagery, and expansive forms. The composer was no longer a skilled craftsman serving a church or a noble court. He was now a visionary, a tormented genius, an artist hero speaking from the depths of his soul. The orchestra grew to mammoth proportions to accommodate this new expressive range. Composers like Hector Berlioz, with his Symphonie Fantastique, painted wild, hallucinatory stories with sound, using a vast palette of instrumental colors to depict scenes of witches, sabbaths, and opium-induced dreams. The piano, perfected with its Castilian frame and greater dynamic range, became the quintessential romantic instrument, a vehicle for intimate confession and thunderous virtuosity. In the hands of Frédéric Chopin, it whispered delicate, poetic nocturnes. Under the fingers of Franz Liszt, it became an orchestra in itself, capable of demonic fury and transcendental technical display. This new focus on the inner world gave rise to new musical forms perfectly suited to the expression of a single mood or poetic idea. The short character piece for piano with titles like Intermezzo, Song Without Words, or Impromptu became immensely popular. These were musical miniatures, capturing a fleeting moment of melancholy, joy, or nostalgia. The art song, or Lied, flourished, particularly in the German-speaking world. Composers like Franz Schubert and Robert Schumann took great poetry and set it to music that not only accompanied the words but delved into their subconscious emotional landscape. The piano part became an equal partner to the voice, painting the rustle of leaves in a linden tree or the turning of a ghostly mill wheel. Programmed music, instrumental music that told a specific story or depicted a scene, landscape, or idea became a dominant force. Bedřich Smetana's The Moldau traced the course of a great river, while Richard Strauss's tone poems detailed the adventures of Don Quixote or the philosophical musings of Zarathustra. Music was now aspiring to the condition of poetry and painting, seeking to tell stories and evoke images directly through sound. Nationalism also became a powerful driving force. As nations across Europe sought to assert their cultural identities, composers began to infuse their music with the folk songs, dances, and legends of their homelands. In Russia, a group known as the Five, including Modest Mussorgsky and Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, created a distinctly Russian sound, drawing on the history and folklore of their native land, often with a raw, unpolished power. In Bohemia, Antonin Dvořák wove the rhythms of Slavic folk dances into his symphonies. In Norway, Edvard Grieg captured the misty fjords and rustic dances of his country. This nationalist impulse enriched the musical language of the entire continent, introducing new scales, rhythms, and harmonic colors. The Romantic era was a vast and sprawling period, encompassing the delicate intimacy of a Chopin prelude, the gargantuan ambitions of Gustav Mahler's symphonies, and the theatrical spectacle of Richard Wagner's operas, which sought to create a total work of art. It was an age of extremes, where music reached for the sublime, the terrifying, and the profoundly personal, forever expanding the boundaries of what sound could express. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the world stood on the brink of unprecedented change. The old orders were crumbling, and with them, the certainties of the Romantic era. The musical language that had served composers for centuries, the system of tonality with its comforting resolutions and emotional signposts, began to fracture under the weight of new ideas and a rapidly modernizing world. The first tremors were felt in the late works of composers like Richard Wagner, whose dense, ever-shifting harmonies stretched tonality to its breaking point. Then came the decisive break. In the early 1900s, the Viennese composer Arnold Schoenberg declared the emancipation of the dissonance. He proposed that all 12 notes of the chromatic scale were equal, and he developed a system to organize them called serialism or 12-tone technique. This was a radical departure. Music was no longer centered around a home key. It was atonal, adrift in a sea of equal musical possibilities. To many listeners, it was shocking, chaotic, a disturbing reflection of a new, uncertain age. This path was followed by his students Albenberg and Anton Webern, who explored the stark, expressionist, and intensely concentrated possibilities of this new language, creating music that was often brief, abstract, and psychologically complex. This was not the only path forward. Other composers reacted to the lush excesses of Romanticism by stripping music down to its bare essentials. In France, Claude Debussy, though often called an impressionist, was forging a new sonic world. He rejected Germanic development and drama, instead creating music of sensation and atmosphere. His compositions, like La Mer or Prelude, A.L. Aprasmidi, Dune Fawn, are built from shimmering scales, unresolved chords, and delicate textures, evoking the play of light on water or the hazy feeling of a dream. This desire for clarity and objectivity took a more severe form in the movement known as neoclassicism. Igor Stravinsky, after causing a riot with the primal, rhythmic fury of his ballet The Rite of Spring, later turned his back on romantic expressionism. He began to compose music that looked back to the clear forms and crisp textures of the Baroque and Classical periods, but with a modern, dissonant bite. His works from this period are witty, precise, and emotionally detached, a calculated and brilliant reaction against the subjective outpouring of the Romantics. The 20th century became a landscape of dizzying diversity, a cacophony of competing isms. The United States emerged as a musical powerhouse, contributing the syncopated rhythms of jazz, which would profoundly influence composers like George Gershwin and the austere, patriotic simplicity of Aaron Copland's American sound. In the second half of the century, technology became a new instrument. Composers like Pierre Schaeffer in France began to manipulate recorded sounds on tape, creating music concrete, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen in Germany pioneered entirely electronic music, generated by oscillators and synthesizers. Meanwhile, chance music, or aleatoric music, introduced by John Cage, questioned the very nature of music itself. In his famous piece for Feat 33, the performer makes no sound, forcing the audience to listen to the ambient noise of the environment. It was a radical proposition that music is not just organized sound, but simply the act of listening. The modern age had shattered the unified musical language of the past, leaving a fragmented, challenging, and endlessly varied soundscape, a direct echo of the complex, multifaceted, and often bewildering world of the 20th century. The story of music in the late 20th and early 21st centuries is a story of unprecedented access and radical democratization. The previous boundaries that had defined musical experience, geography, genre, and the very medium of sound began to dissolve. The first great wave of this transformation was the global circulation of popular music, driven by the power of radio, television, and the vinyl record. American rock and roll, born from the potent blend of blues, country, and gospel, became a worldwide phenomenon, its rebellious energy resonating with a post-war youth culture. The British invasion, led by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, swept across the globe, only to be met and influenced by new sounds emerging from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Music was no longer a local tradition or a high art form confined to concert halls. It was a global conversation, a cultural force that could define a generation, challenge political powers, and create a shared identity across continents. The album became a cohesive artistic statement, and the recording studio itself transformed from a simple documentarian of a performance into a creative instrument, allowing for multi-track layering and sonic experimentation that was impossible in a live setting. This global conversation accelerated into a true revolution with the advent of the digital age. The invention of the compact disc in the 1980s promised perfect, pristine sound, free from the cracks and pops of analog vinyl. But the true paradigm shift came with the development of the MP3 format and the rise of the internet. For the first time in history, music was liberated from its physical container. A symphony, a rock song, or a folk ballad could be reduced to a stream of data, instantly transmitted across the world at virtually no cost. This created the celestial jukebox, an almost infinite library of music available on demand. Platforms like Napster, and later Spotify and Apple Music, transformed listening from an act of ownership of holding a record or a CD to an act of access through subscription and streaming. The entire history of recorded sound, from the earliest ethnographic field recordings to the latest electronic single, was now side by side in the digital cloud, available to anyone with an internet connection. This new reality has had profound and contradictory consequences. On one hand, it has led to an incredible cross-pollination of styles. A producer in a bedroom studio can effortlessly sample a recording of Tibetan monks, layer it over a drum beat inspired by West African rhythms, and add a melody played on a synthesizer emulating a 1980s sound, creating a new genre that defies easy categorization. The very concept of a mainstream has fragmented into 1,000 niche genres, each with its own dedicated online community. Algorithms now curate our listening, suggesting new music based on our past preferences, creating personalized radio stations that can feel both magically intuitive and strangely limiting. The role of the composer and performer has expanded to include the bedroom producer, the YouTube virtuoso, and the viral TikTok creator. The journey that began with a bone flute in a dark cave has now arrived at a point where every human with a smartphone holds the entirety of the world's musical heritage in their pocket. The story of music is no longer a single, linear narrative. It is a vast, sprawling, and simultaneous network of sounds. A global symphony being composed by billions, all listening, all creating, all connected in the great humming datasphere of the modern world. From the first, tentative strike of a hollow log to the vast, invisible streams of data that now carry symphonies across the globe in an instant. The story of music is the story of humanity itself. It is a thread that connects us to the deepest parts of our past and to the most hopeful visions of our future. We have traced this thread from the elemental rhythms of nature and the human body through the sacred chants of ancient temples and the grand architectures of polyphony, into the passionate outpourings of the individual soul, and finally to the fragmented, globalized, and digitally rendered soundscape of the present day. Through every transformation, through every revolution in technology and thought, the essential impulse remains unchanged. Music is, and has always been, a fundamental human need to communicate what words cannot, to express the inexpressible, to forge community, to touch the divine, and to simply say, I feel, I am here. Consider the unbroken line that connects us to that distant past, the driving rhythm of a modern dance track, felt in the chest of a listener in a crowded club, is a direct descendant of the stomping feet and clapping hands around a primal fire. The haunting melody of a film score, designed to evoke a sense of wonder or loss, shares its ancestral DNA with the lone bone flute played in the stillness of a prehistoric cave. The complex, interlocking harmonies of a choir in a great cathedral are the intellectual and spiritual heirs of the first monks who dared to add a second voice to their chant, discovering a new dimension of sound. Every time a child hums a tune of their own invention, or a group of friends sing together, they are participating in this ancient ritual. They are adding their own unique voice to the grand, ongoing composition that is human history. As we look to the future, the forms of music will continue to change in ways we cannot yet imagine. New technologies, artificial intelligence that can compose virtual reality concerts that can transport us to other worlds, biosonification that can turn the body's own processes into sound will undoubtedly reshape the musical landscape once again. But the core will hold the need for a lullaby to soothe a child, for a stirring anthem to unite a people, for a love song to bridge the distance between two hearts, for a solemn dirge to honor the departed. This need is eternal. Music is our companion in joy and in sorrow, a mirror to our inner world and a bridge to the world of others. It is the soundtrack to our lives, the melody of our memories, the rhythm of our hearts. It began with a single, resonant sound in the deep silence of antiquity, and it continues now, an unending river of vibration and emotion, flowing through time, connecting every human who has ever listened, who has ever sung, who has ever played, in a silent, beautiful agreement that some things are beyond words and must be expressed in song. As the digital revolution settles into the fabric of daily life, a new frontier for music is emerging, one that turns inward, merging with the very essence of human biology and consciousness. The exploration is no longer just about creating new sounds for the outer ear, but about composing experiences that interact directly with our neural pathways and physiological states. This is the dawn of bioresponsive music, a realm where the boundary between the listener and the composition becomes fluid and dynamic. Imagine a piece of music that is not a static recording, but a living entity that changes based on the listener's own body. Sensors can monitor a listener's heartbeat, brainwaves, and even subtle shifts in galvanic skin response. This biometric data is then fed into a generative music algorithm, a set of musical rules that translates this physiological information into sound in real time. If your heart rate slows and your brainwaves indicate a state of deep relaxation, the music might respond by becoming more ambient, with slower, drifting harmonies and softer textures. If the sensors detect signs of agitation or stress, the music could gently introduce calming, rhythmic pulses or soothing, low-frequency drones to guide the nervous system back toward equilibrium. This is no longer passive listening. It is a duet between the human body and the musical algorithm, a form of sonic therapy that meets the listener exactly where they are. This convergence of music and technology extends into the realm of artificial intelligence, not as a replacement for the human composer, but as a collaborator of infinite possibility. AI systems, having been trained on the entire corpus of human music from Gregorian chants to free jazz, from Bolognese gamelan to modern pop, can now generate compositions in any style. But the true potential lies in the partnership. A composer can now converse with an AI, offering a seed of a melody, a harmonic progression, or a textual idea, and the AI can generate thousands of variations, orchestrated in the style of different eras, or suggest unexpected developments that the human mind might not have conceived. This partnership pushes creativity into new dimensions, allowing artists to explore a vast, latent space of musical ideas, using the AI as a kind of creative telescope to see further than ever before. Furthermore, in the domain of performance, AI enables hyper-personalization. A single piece of music can be rendered in an infinite number of ways, tailored to an individual's mood, the time of day, or even the weather outside. The concept of a definitive version of a song begins to dissolve. replaced by a fluid, ever-changing musical entity that is uniquely crafted for a single moment and a single listener. The very environment in which we experience music is also being fundamentally reshaped by immersive technologies. With virtual and augmented reality, the concert hall is no longer a physical space, but a limitless digital canvas. One can put on a headset and find themselves not in a crowded arena, but sitting inside the body of a grand piano, watching the hammers dance as a Chopin nocturne plays. The vibrations felt as much as heard. Or they could be transported to a completely abstract synesthetic landscape where melodies manifest as streams of colored light and harmonies shift the very geometry of the world around them. Music becomes a place you can visit, a universe you can inhabit. This is a return, in a way, to the most ancient power of music, the power to transport us, to alter our state of being, to create a sacred space. But now, that space is not just a firelit cave or a Gothic cathedral. It is a personalized, virtual sanctuary designed by light and sound. The journey of music, which began with our ancestors mimicking the world around them, is now circling back to create entirely new worlds for us to inhabit, blurring the final line between the sound we hear and the reality we perceive, and opening a new, boundless chapter in the eternal human song. Beyond the realms of technology and biology, a quieter, more profound evolution is taking place in our understanding of music itself. We are beginning to rediscover the power of the space between the notes, the music that is not played but felt, the silent symphony that resides in anticipation, memory, and the very fabric of human connection. This is not the silence of absence, but the silence of potential, the canvas upon which all sound is painted. In an age of constant auditory stimulation, the deliberate use of silence becomes a revolutionary compositional tool. Modern soundscapes and minimalist compositions explore the beauty of sparse textures, where a single, sustained note hangs in the air, its resonance amplified by the quiet that surrounds it. This draws the listener into a state of deep attention, making them an active participant in the creation of the music, their own breath and heartbeat becoming part of the performance. It is a return to the most ancient form of listening to the world itself, but with a new, conscious intentionality. This exploration extends into the music of human interaction and the rhythms of everyday life. There is a growing appreciation for the inherent musicality found not in concert halls, but in the spontaneous, unrepeatable moments of existence. The rhythmic clatter of a train on its tracks, the melodic call and response of vendors in a market, the complex polyrhythm of a bustling city intersection. These are the folk songs of the modern era. Composers and listeners alike are learning to find music not just in organized sound, but in the patterns and pulses of the world around them. This is a democratization of music even more fundamental than the digital revolution. It is the recognition that the raw materials for music are everywhere, and that everyone possesses an innate ability to perceive and appreciate it. The line between musician and audience, between composition and life, begins to blur in the most beautiful way. Furthermore, music is increasingly understood as a vibrational bridge between individuals, a non-verbal language of empathy. The phenomenon of neural coupling, where the brainwaves of a speaker and a listener synchronize, occurs even more powerfully with music. When people sing together in a choir, or even just tap their feet in unison at a concert, their nervous systems begin to align. This shared biological experience creates a profound sense of community and belonging, a silent understanding that bypasses the need for words. In this sense, the most important music is not always the one that is heard by the ears, but the one that is felt by the heart. The unspoken harmony between people, the rhythmic connection between a parent and a child, the shared silent understanding that passes between friends listening to a beloved song. This is the music that heals, that connects, that reminds us of our shared humanity. It is the silent symphony that has been playing all along. Beneath the flutes and the drums and the digital streams, the eternal resonant frequency of connection that is, perhaps, the first and last true music. As our gaze turns upward to the star-dusted expanse of the cosmos, the story of music embarks on its most speculative and awe-inspiring chapter. For millennia, music has been an earthly phenomenon, shaped by the acoustics of our forests, caves, and concert halls, by the rhythms of our biology, and by the cultural currents of our civilizations. But now, we stand at the threshold of composing the first true celestial music, sound conceived for and within the environment of space itself. The vacuum of space, of course, carries no sound as we know it, yet this very silence becomes a new medium. Scientists have long been able to sonify data, translating the invisible forces of the cosmos into audible experiences. The magnetic fields of planets, the radio emissions from distant pulsars, the subtle vibrations of solar flares, all can be mapped into musical scales and rhythms, creating symphonies from the humming of the universe. These are not mere scientific curiosities, they are profound listenings, allowing us to hear the music the planets have been singing for eons, a grand, cosmic orchestra we are only now developing the ears to hear. The experience of creating and hearing music would be fundamentally altered for astronauts traveling through space or living on other worlds. Imagine a composer on a lunar base, looking up at the suspended jewel of Earth. In the low-gravity environment, the physical act of playing an instrument would change. The bow of a violin might float with a new elegance. The breath required for a flute might be less the reverberation. Inside a space station would be unlike any chamber on Earth. The very psychology of music would shift. Compositions might reflect the profound loneliness and breathtaking beauty of the void, the fragile wonder of a single biosphere against the infinite dark. What would a lullaby sound like when sung to a child born on Mars under its rusty-hued sky? What rhythms would emerge from a colony celebrating its first harvest, the drums echoing in a pressurized dome? This would be the birth of an entirely new branch of music, unshackled from terrestrial references, born from the direct human experience of the cosmos. And then there is the most profound question of all. If we are listening to the universe, is the universe listening back? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence has, for decades, scanned the heavens not for images, but for patterns in radio signals, a form of music, perhaps from a distant world. The message we chose to represent humanity on the Voyager Golden Record was not a treatise on politics or science, but a collection of our music from Bach and Beethoven to Blind Willie Johnson and the panpipes of Peru. We instinctively understood that music is the purest expression of what it means to be human, a language of mathematics and emotion that might be universally understood. As we project our own music into the void and learn to hear the music of the cosmos, we are participating in the oldest and grandest of human traditions, the act of reaching out, of seeking connection through the universal language of vibration and rhythm. The story that began with a rhythm beaten on a log in a primeval forest may one day continue in a duet between a human composer and an intelligence from another star, a final beautiful proof that music is, and always has been, the true connective tissue of existence. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey, not with a grand finale, but with a gentle return to the source. We have traversed the vast expanse of musical time, from the first percussive heartbeat echoing in a primeval valley to the silent, data-driven symphonies of the future, and even beyond, to the very edges of our celestial imagination. We have seen music as ritual, as science, as rebellion, as therapy, and as a bridge to the stars. We have witnessed its forms transform, its instruments evolve, and its purposes multiply. Yet, through every iteration, its essence has remained constant. Music is the sound of life itself, striving to understand its own existence. The last note in this great symphony is not a sound that fades into silence. It is the understanding that the music was never truly out there, in the flute, or the string, or the star. It was always within. It is the rhythm of your own pulse, the melody of your thoughts, the harmony of your memories. The true instrument has always been the human being, the body that feels the rhythm, the mind that comprehends the pattern, the heart that is moved by the beauty of a phrase. The countless composers and performers throughout history were merely midwives, helping to bring this inner music into the shared world of sound. They gave form to the formless, voice to the voiceless yearning that resides in every soul. Therefore, let this history settle not as a record of the past, but as an invitation to the present. The symphony does not end because this story does. It continues in the quiet hum of your own awareness. It is in the next breath you take, the next smile you share, the next moment of stillness you find. The great, unending song of humanity is not a performance to be observed. It is a living, breathing reality in which you are both the composer and the most attentive listener. The music is now. It is here. It is you. And in this realization, the story finds its only true and perfect ending, which is, of course, no ending at all.